Thank you very much, Caroline, and good evening, everybody. I will just put these into presentation mode. So my name is Francesca Day, and I am the head of the therapeutic area department here at the agency. Before joining EMA, which was about 3 years ago, I had over 20 years experience in the pharmaceutical industry. So I think I'm sort of qualified enough to talk to you today about the transition or the journey, let's say, between the submission of the dossier all the way through the assessment and the preparation of the final assessment report. So we'll go through these aspects. But before we sort of get into that in particular, I just wanted to go over a little bit, a couple of things that you've already hopefully listened to in previous presentations, but just as a bit of a sort of reminder and also to orientate ourselves about what we're talking about. So you've heard about marketing authorizations, not only in this lecture course, but hopefully previously. As you know, it's imperative that in order to place a medicinal product on the market in the EU or in any EU member state or EEA member state, you must receive a marketing authorization. So you can't just sort of decide to place something on the market without due scrutiny. The application can be made either nationally, so to each member state where you potentially would like to market the product, or centrally via the EMA. And I'll go through some of the criteria for that in just a minute. If you've decided to go the national route, then the regulatory authority in each one of those countries will grant you a marketing authorization. If you go through the central route, then the EMA via the network will perform the scientific assessment, and it's finally the European Commission that grants the marketing authorization. And you've heard these numbers before, but the whole of the sort of legal regulatory framework that we operate in is based on one regulation and one directive that you are more than welcome to look up, and that you probably already know are currently under revision by the Commission, and we will get some new regulations and directives in the nearish future. So just again, as a bit of a refresher, I mentioned there's a central route through EMA and a national route for submitting a marketing authorization application. And there are some criteria that apply to the centralized procedure. And the centralized procedure is compulsory for a number of different indications. They're listed here, but in essence, there's a specificity for HIV, so AIDS and HIV products, for cancer. So everything that has an indication for cancer must go through the centralized procedure. Diabetes, neurodegenerative diseases, autoimmune diseases, viral diseases, any advanced therapy, biotechnology processes, orphan medicines, etc. So there's quite a list of products that are coming through the centralized procedure because it's mandated by the legislation. Companies can also try to access the centralized procedure on a ad hoc basis for indications that are not listed here, and that can be also granted by EMA and the committees on a case-by-case basis. But because we're talking about cancer, all applications since the inception really of the EMA come through the centralized procedure for any oncology products. This is also something that we've mentioned previously in other lectures, but there are also different types of application, and it really is based on what's included in the dossier for the product that's being submitted. These are defined in the Directive 2001/83 and in various articles in the directive. So we talk about an Article 8.3 submission, which means it's a full application, a complete dossier for a product. But then there's also a certain amount of abridging that's allowed for certain other submissions. So generic medicinal products have a different content dossier. Hybrids are the same, biosimilar products. So there's a number of different types of dossiers that will be submitted to the agency depending on the legal basis that is chosen by the applicant for that submission. So that's sort of the framework that we operate in, and hopefully that was just more of a reminder than anything new. So let's look at then the documentation that's needs to be included in a marketing authorization application. It's a very well-defined set of documentation that we require. And this is a sort of picture that maybe you will have seen in other presentation. The MMA structure is based on a format called the Common Technical Document, and this was agreed years ago at ICH. So in international setting with other regulators, so FDA, Health Canada, Swissmedic, many regulators across the globe got together and decided on a common technical document that would support applications in all those territories. This would then mean that it's simpler for companies to prepare one global submission that will then be sufficient for submission in all ICH, at least territories. So what is the common technical document? It's a huge number of documents, and they're structured in this sort of pyramid. At the bottom, you will see there's three what we call modules: Module 3, Module 4, and Module 5. And this is really all the reports and all the data that supports the marketing authorization in accordance with the applicant, at least. So we have a lot of quality data that needs to be submitted, quite a number of non-clinical reports that need to be submitted, and also a number of clinical study reports that need to be submitted. So these are submitted in their full format, including data, and I'll go into that in a minute, what these look like in these three modules. Because this is a huge body of data, then they are summarized in clinical, non-clinical, and quality summaries. So these are summaries prepared by the companies that to essentially try and bring together all of the data into one document that explains in summary what is being submitted and in support of the proposed indication for the product. What we call this part here, this sort of middle section of the pyramid, is Module 2. So we have a quality overall summary, so a summary that essentially encompasses the whole quality, all the manufacturing process, all the stability testing, etc., for the product. We have non-clinical summaries and clinical summaries that go into essentially doing a distillation of all of the data included in Module 4 and Module 5. And we also have an even further step of summarization in the form of a non-clinical overview and a clinical overview. So these are even more condensed documents that summarize even more all of the studies included in the dossier, and really then make the link to the indication and the product information that is being submitted. So these are the documents that really link the data to then the claims that the applicant is making on the product. And then the top part of the pyramid here is called Module 1, and this differs in every country. So the EMA Module 1 is quite different to the FDA Module 1, also different to the Japanese Module 1, and it's a regional administrative information part. So here the countries really each have a different set of requirements that need to be fulfilled in order to have a complete dossier for the application. So in summary, we have a Module 1, which is a local administrative information, a Module 2, which really is overviews and summaries of all of the data, and then Module 3, 4, and 5 that are the data, essentially in the form of study reports or quality reports. All of this, once upon a time, used to be in paper, and there used to be boxes and boxes and boxes of documents delivered to agencies via DHL. Now, thankfully, it's all electronic. So we talk about eCTD, so the electronic technical document, and it's all submitted through a gateway in essentially electronic format, all searchable, all hyperlinked, and way, way easier than doing it all in paper. So this is sort of the overall structure of the documentation. But then what does that sort of mean in practice? And here is one example of one submission for one relatively simple product. So a single substance, one only indication, only 2 phase 3 studies. And this is in practice what it looks like. And here is a list of all of the documents submitted in the application. You see, this is module 1. These are all, each one of these documents is one PDF of information. And the PDF could be 2 pages, it could be 2,000 pages. And this is what the submission looks like. Essentially, it's 25 of these pages, and overall, it's the whole of the dossier is 1,250 PDFs. That's a huge amount of data, a huge amount of documentation. As I've said, some of these PDFs are thousands of pages long. Some could only be 1 or 2 pages, but it's all together makes part of that submission. And you see why it's way easier that it's now electronic rather than having to sift through, tens of thousands of paper pages. Now with hyperlinks, etc., it's much easier to navigate. But it still is a huge amount of data and a huge amount of information to get through. So I mentioned there's a lot of data, a lot of reports. We'll focus on the clinical because this is really the sort of a target audience, let's say. So some of you already probably know what a clinical study report looks like. You maybe been involved as investigators in studies. And this is just an example, and I took this from our Policy 70 repository. So these are published and available online and redacted, so I'm not disclosing anything I shouldn't do. But from any company for any submission, and I think this is the Tagrisso one, if I'm not mistaken, you have a clinical study report. Quite often the report itself, the actual wording, the sort of explanation of what happened, etc., is between 100 and 300 pages. It depends. But then as part of the report, the protocol is also included and any amendments to the protocol. And sometimes there's multiple amendments, 6, 7 protocol amendments, so 6, 7, 200, 300 pages protocols. There's also always a statistical analysis plan for that study. That can also be quite extensive. A huge amount of information regarding the conduct of the study, so financial disclosures, CVs of investigators, etc. There's a lot of administrative bits and pieces that go into a clinical study report. And then the real bulk of it all is the thousands and thousands of pages of line listings. So here on the right is an example of one line listing, again, from one study. When you conduct a clinical study, you would have thousands, hundreds, depends, of patients, and you will have them come for a visit every 4 weeks, potentially, for maybe 2 or 3 years. It depends on the indication and what you're studying. At every visit, you will measure a number of different parameters for that patient, whether it's blood, whether it's x-rays, biopsies, and each one of those data points is captured, obviously, in a database that the company holds. But the output that the EMA received is essentially this collection of PDFs with every single data point recorded, presented. And that, again, thousands and thousands of pages of really sort of almost typewritten, very old-fashioned type data that we receive. So a lot to get through. To then go into a little bit more about what are in this massive array of documents that we receive, what are really the true important documents from a clinical perspective. Now, like I said, we're really focusing on clinical here today. A quality person might have a completely different view of what's important. But here on the left are the sort of modules, let's say, that are quite important to really look into from a clinical perspective. For every submission, there comes a cover letter, and that's obviously going to explain a lot about the context of the submission and anything in particular that the company would like to draw attention to for the assessors. We also have a application form. Every different regulator has a different application form. The EMA one is really quite extensive with a lot of information, in particular on manufacturing included, but also on various clinical sides of it. So It's a PDF application form, and that contains a lot of information that needs to be gone through by the assessors. We then have in module 1.3.1 the summary of product characteristics and Annex 2 and the product leaflet for the patients. So this is essentially the product information that the applicants will submit with their proposed, let's say, information for the product. And we'll go into that in a little bit more detail in a minute. In module 1 is also included the risk management plan, the RMP, that the company will provide. So together with their proposed product information, they also have a proposed risk management plan. Unsurprisingly, generally speaking, it's quite empty. There's supposedly not many risks in the view of the company, and not a huge amount of planned post-approval studies to manage those risks. But again, it's an initial submission, so that's the proposal from the company. And then I mentioned these modules: the clinical overview, the summaries, and the study reports. So the clinical overview is basically the distillate of the company's thinking around what the claims in their SMPC are supported by. So you should really find in the clinical overview the justification for any of the claims made in the product information. It's not always necessarily the case that everything is well justified, but that's the idea with the clinical overview. And then I mentioned when we were looking at the pyramid, the summaries, and these are divided into 3 particular summaries that are important from a clinical perspective. We have a summary of clinical pharmacology, a summary of clinical efficacy, and a summary of clinical safety. And here's where the companies will go into a lot more detail, not as detailed as the study reports, but a detail about the general clinical pharmacology, PK, PD for the product. They'll talk about the clinical efficacy, so the studies and any potential meta-analysis that they would have done across studies will be in the clinical efficacy summary. And then, of course, in 274, they will look at the whole of their safety database across all clinical trials and summarize their sort of findings in terms of safety. And the CSRs, as we mentioned in the beginning, they are really the true reports, each report for one individual clinical study. So that's sort of the real documentation that from a clinical perspective we would focus on. Now, it really depends on the assessor which way round they would like to do it. So I've heard both ways. I've heard from assessors that they will start from the clinical overview and work their way, sort of drill down through the summaries into the actual clinical study reports. And I've heard the opposite. I've heard of various assessors who would prefer to start with the clinical study reports and work their way up through the summaries, through the clinical overview. But whether they choose to do it downwards or upwards, it's always with the product information, the SMPC, as a reference. So what they are doing is making sure that the claims in the SMPC are supported by data in the applicant's submission. And then I've got a couple of bullets here just to quickly mention that Annex 2 is a annex we'll get into in a little while that will capture all of the conditions related to the product's authorization. So it's submitted empty by the applicants and it gets filled by EMA and CHMP. And the pill is the product information for the patient. So it's the actual physical leaflet that you find in the product box. And that's generally looked at after the SMPC has been it's nearly final, so that there's then a translation, let's say, to the information for the patients. Okay, so those were the documents, sort of important documents in the submission. And then what are the important documents in the approval? In a way, the same ones. So the SMPC is really at the end of the condensed information on the product for use by the prescriber. So it's really the absolute distillation of how to use the product and what to do with patients in various circumstances when prescribing the product. It's also very important to companies because they are not allowed to prepare any promotional materials that is not in concordance with the SMPC. So it's very important for companies to get certain claims in the SMPCs so that that can be used then when they go and speak to prescribers. I mentioned Annex 2. So Annex 2 contains then all of the manufacturing site details and the batch release sites in the EU. So basically sort of stipulates quite clearly who can make and who can release the product in Europe. And it also importantly contains any conditions that are related to that marketing authorization. And that really depends very much on the assessment and whether there are any impositions that the CHMP would like to make on the use of that product and for the company to abide by. And then, of course, the other very important document in the approval is the risk management plan. I mentioned that when it's submitted by the companies, it's quite often a little bit empty because, of course, they would imagine very little risk. But by the time it gets through the whole of the assessment procedure, then it gets a little bit more let's say concrete, and it's a plan that's agreed with the company to basically monitor the safety of the product once it gets on the market. So it will include all of the post-approval commitments that the company is undertaking to do. And these are divided into 3 categories. So we have category 1 that are basically imposed mandatory conditions, which will also be in Annex 2. Then we have category 2, which are specific obligations that are related to an agreement to have a conditional marketing authorization or an exceptional circumstances, MA, and you've heard about those already. So those are category 2 also in Annex 2. And then we have category 3, which is any other pharmacovigilance activities that are not are still legally binding, but they're not in Annex 2 of the product information. So we have a variety of different levels, let's say, or grades of impositions that we can make on companies. And really, I mentioned this in a few instances. The SMPC is really the pivotal document in the submission. If you think about it, everything in the whole of the eCTD in the end points to the SMPC. So all of the data from the quality module, the non-clinical module, the clinical, all of this through the summaries and through the overviews is then really, really distilled into the SMPC. So the SMPC needs to be supported. Every claim in the SMPC needs to be justified and needs to be data-based. And that's what the assessors will be looking for. Again, a little bit more about the SMPC. I mentioned it's the basis of the information on how to use the product safely. It's really the integral part of the marketing authorization. And it's also critical for companies because any promotional materials related to the product must comply with all of these statements and particulars in the SMPC. Any factors that might influence the benefit or the risk for an individual should be clearly described in the SMPC. And of course, it's not a static document. So we will talk a little bit about post-approval at the end of this talk, but the SMPC is updated throughout the life cycle of the product as new data emerges. So when you look at the SMPC from a healthcare professional perspective, from a prescriber perspective, it should really give you then the information you need to decide if a product is indicated for a particular patient, to identify very quickly any contraindications or any precautions that need to be taken before or during treatment or after treatment, understand clearly the posology and the method of administration. It should sort of inform, obviously, on the potential benefits from the product, but also any potential unfavorable effects, so potential side effects for the product, including how frequent they are and their severity. It should also give some information on how to manage these, not all, but some of the side effects that might potentially need, some more attention, and so how to manage those. And also, if this information is available in the beginning, it should also describe how to use the product in certain special populations. So I mentioned here renally impaired patients, but hepatically impaired, or children, or pregnant women. So there's a number of situations where the product might need to be used a bit differently, and that needs to be clear in the SMPC. So in summary, the SMPC is not a summary of the development program that was undertaken. It doesn't explain why the marketing authorization was granted. It's not a therapeutic guideline either, so it doesn't explain disease management, and it's not supposed to be a promotional document, so it shouldn't be making statements that are unsubstantiated. What it is an intrinsic part of the marketing authorization. It's distilled during the assessment process. It's approved by the EMA, the CHMP, or the National Competent Authority. And it really is the basis for the prescriber, for the healthcare professional, to use the medicine safely and effectively in their patients. Here I just have a quick example. I'm sure that you've all seen SMPCs. This is Keytruda SMPC, and it just shows you how, for example, the therapeutic indication is described. And here, Keytruda has quite a lot of therapeutic indications. And you can look SMPCs up on our website if you want. In particular, looking at the therapeutic indication, this is also very important. It's the most important section, I would say, of the SMPC, because it actually it defines clearly the target disease, the target population, and any restrictions to that target population. So it's very clear what the product should be used for and in whom. That's what the therapeutic indication should do. Section 4.2 then, which is the posology, should really sort of specify the dose recommendation, the method of administration also, and it should cover the entire indication population. So if the indication includes children, it should be also very clear what the dose is for children, for example. And it should not make any dose recommendations, of course, in patients that are not included in the indication. And then the other section that's often quite important for the companies is section 5.1, which really provides a lot of details on the scientific basis for the indication. So it's where the clinical trial data is captured. And this, again, should really reflect the indication. So we never include data that's not part of the indication, or in patients that are not included in the indication. And then the assessment report is quite different to the SMPC. So in the assessment report, we justify much more clearly why the SMPC is worded the way it is and why the marketing authorization was granted. The SMPC does not do that. If you want to have a look at more SMPCs in a lot more detail, there's a lot of useful links here. I assume we send the slides, Caroline, I don't know, but there's a lot of information on the EMA website to look at all the particulars around the SMPC. And if you were to be interested and you wanted to learn more and become involved with our network, then there's a lot of courses that we offer on the Network Training Center around the SMPC. So there's a lot more that you can really get into if you do decide indeed to take the step further and become more involved with our activities in the network. So the other document I mentioned was the risk management plan, and I'll just very quickly talk about that for a couple of slides. So the risk management plan, as I mentioned, is the agreed plan at the end to look at the safety risks around the product and how to monitor them and potentially minimize them or study them. So there is a safety specification, which is essentially the identified safety concerns with the product, identified risks with the product, but also potential risks. So not necessarily absolutely understood or found in clinical trials, but maybe based on mechanism of action, etc., potential risks, and also missing information. So the safety specification really says what we know from a safety perspective about this product. We then have risk minimization, which is interventions to try and minimize, obviously, those risks. A lot of them are already included in the SMPC. So, for example, for renal impaired patients, you have to reduce the dose or something like that. but it could also take the form of additional risk minimization measures. So, for example, educational materials that are sent out to prescribers, etc. So that's also included in the RMP. And lastly, there has to be a pharmacovigilance plan. So in order to assess some of these risks and concerns, there will be some studies that might need to be conducted. They could be category 1, 2, 3, as I described earlier. So there will be generally some post-authorization measures. And at absolute minimum, if really there's no particular study that's been included, there will always be, and we'll talk about it at the end, a periodic safety update that will be needed to be submitted on the product. Moving on to the clinical overview, just a little bit more detail. So as I mentioned that it's really the ultimate distillate between data and SMPC. So it really has to provide a detailed factual summarization of the clinical information and a little bit of a discussion about these findings and any relevant information. It also describes the overall clinical development program for that product and why that development was conducted in that way. It needs to also show us the clinical findings as an overview and any important limitations of the data and the studies that were conducted. It will provide an evaluation of the benefits and risks, obviously the company's perspective on those, based on the studies that were conducted. And they will also address any particular issues, in particular safety issues that were encountered and how they were evaluated and, if possible, resolved. And then for any unresolved issues, it needs to explain what the plan is in terms of future potential studies to explore and understand. And then it also will explain the basis for any sort of strange prescription or prescribing information in the SMPC. So it really has to make the link between data and SMPC. We also have a lot of information on our website on RMP and the clinical overview. So again, if you are interested, you can go through the EMA website and find that information. So having described a little bit the dossier itself, let's talk about the assessment process and how that is carried out. So at EMA, it's not only EMA, all international regulators, it's absolutely imperative that we ensure that the work is done scientifically and with no conflict of interest, so that we really are not swayed by anything that the companies might have an interest in letting us know. So we manage very carefully any conflict of interest. So all of the experts that we use, even the staff at EMA and the management board, etc., we must not have any financial interest in any companies, any pharmaceutical companies. And if you have had, like myself, if you worked for a company in the past, there are very strict limitations to what you're able to do or not, and for how long at the EMA and in the network. We also have this principle of peer review. So the EMA assessment is carried out by a rapporteur and a co-rapporteur. So we always have this principle of 2 pairs of eyes. In some instances, maybe, and now we just have 1 rapporteur, but generally speaking, 2 rapporteurs for every dossier, independent review. And then it's always, every single submission is always subject to committee discussion. So all you've heard about CHMP, all member states are represented at the CHMP. So we have 27 pairs of eyes essentially looking at every submission, with the rapporteur and the co-rapporteur in the lead, really digging into the data into detail. And also at EMA, as I'm sure you're aware, we also have very high transparency standards. So we really do publish a lot of the work that we do. Assessment reports are published, as well as agendas and minutes of committees, so that it's clear to everybody how the decisions were come to. So for each application I mentioned, we have 2 rapporteurs, 2 CHMP rapporteurs, and we even have a 3rd rapporteur. So there's a separate rapporteur for PRAC, for the Pharmacovigilance Committee, so that we have essentially 3 delegations from 3 different member states looking at the dossier in detail. The rapporteur teams assess independently, so they will each do their own independent assessment. And in each member state, they then decide how to subdivide this Mostly it's divided into quality, non-clinical, clinical between different assessment teams, but there potentially is even more subdivision. In some cases, we'll have a PK assessor separate from efficacy, safety, and we have statisticians involved, etc. So there's an assessment team assembled around the dossier in every member state that is a rapporteur or a co-rapporteur. You've also already seen the whole phases of assessment, so you know about day 120 and day 180, etc. In the first phase of the assessment, which is between day 0 and day 120, we have a number of reports that are created. So by day 80, the rapporteur will produce 3 reports, one on quality, one on non-clinical, and one on clinical. And these are quite detailed reports on these topics. And they will also produce what we call an overview document. And this is, as the name sort of indicates, one overarching document that then sort of summarizes even more quality, non-clinical, clinical aspects of the dossier. Then by day 95, the co-rapporteur, who have done their own independent assessment, will add their thoughts in special comment boxes on the co-rapporteur overview. So they will do a sort of let's say, intervention on top of the rapporteur's report, so that we maintain one report with 2 then different thoughts streams, let's say, at day 95. Between day 80 and day 100, all member states are able and invited to send comments on the reports that they see. So that's where the 27 different pairs of eyes come in. And we have a peer review teleconferences, which is organized by day 110, including both rapporteur teams, the PRAC rapporteur, the EMA product lead, where the rapporteurs all sort of come together and essentially compare notes on the dossier and agree to a consolidated list of questions to send to the applicant. And that list of questions is then presented by day 120 to the committee at CHMP, where it's then adopted and sent to the applicant at day 120. So we also have all of our assessment report templates online. So if you want to have a look and see in detail what the assessment templates look like, again, you can go to the EMA website, and there's a number there that you can start to dig into and take a look at. I just very quickly took a few screenshots. So I'm not sure if you're interested in non-clinical report, but if we go to the clinical report for day 80, for example, you'll see on the right here, it's divided in clinical pharmacology, clinical efficacy, clinical safety. We have sections at the bottom on risk management plan and pharmacovigilance system. Within the clinical efficacy, there will be a description of the main studies, but also the general clinical development. Also any sort of good clinical practice aspects, etc. And we always have the overall rapporteur assessment of the section. So within ClinPharm, there's an overall rapporteur assessment of ClinPharm, and efficacy, there's an overall assessment of efficacy, and the same for the safety. And then in the overview, this is again where the 3 reports sort of really are summarized and come together. Then you see in the overview we have recommendations to begin with from the rapporteurs, if there are any inspection issues, etc. We have an executive summary about the product that really sort of describes the product itself and the development program. And then in the scientific overview and discussion, we have again division into quality, non-clinical, clinical, risk management plan, and pharmacovigilance also. And then really the bit that is the core, let's say, of the assessment report, the overview, is the benefit risk assessment. And you heard all about this from Francesco in the previous lecture. And this is really where the real evaluation of the benefits versus the risks of that product takes place. And then we have a list of questions, which is where the questions that were agreed by the rapporteurs will be transposed, and any recommendations about the authorization. So this is really the evolution of the reports from the beginning through day 180, day 120, day 180 and beyond. So I already mentioned the first reports at day 80, day 95, day 120. As you know, we have a clock stop at day 120 to respond to the questions. And then when we get to the second evaluation, We have a joint report at day 150 where the rapporteurs will look at the responses from the applicants. And then this will be then consolidated with member state comments, etc., to a day 180 report, also called the list of outstanding issues, which is adopted by the CHMP. And as you know already, at day 180, we have another clock stop. When the responses to that come in, then we have a day 195 rapporteurs report, and which is eventually then, again, with member state comments, etc., consolidated into a day 210 CHMP report. And this is the final report that the CHMP adopts. Oh, sorry, this shouldn't say list of outstanding issues, that's a typo. This day 210 CHMP report is then looked at together with the company to make sure that we remove any personal data, any confidential information, etc. And it will eventually become the final European Patient Assessment Assessment Report, or EPA, that will be published on the EMA website after the Commission has given their decision on the marketing authorization. So a little bit more about the EPA. So it's this public assessment report that we publish for every product. Again, if you want to go and have a look at our website, there's plenty of products there. Each product, when you type in the name, will take you to the EPA page. And the EPA is basically these four parts. There's the overview, so it's a very sort of lay-person, public-friendly question and answer type format on the product. We have the authorization details about the product itself, the product information, which is the SMPC and the Annex 2 and the patient information leaflet. And then we also have assessment history on the product itself, with the assessment reports that are made at every one of the steps. So for the initial marketing authorization, the assessment report will be there. And then any other reports for any updates to the SMPC will also be in this section. And as it says here, all the parts of the EPA are updated when there are major changes to the authorization. Again, here I've got a couple of links to a couple of EPA pages, but if you go onto the EMA website and search for a product, you will basically be taken to that product's EPA page. We also publish, or we always did publish RMP summaries in the EPA page. Now we're moving actually to full RMPs, obviously redacted for any personal or confidential information. So you will find now also on EPA pages more and more full RMPs being published. So that's sort of the bulk of what happens during the assessment of an MAA, but then that's not where it all ends. We also have changes post-approval. So once the product is approved, it essentially, once it receives the approval from the Commission, it can be placed on the market in Europe, in any or one member state. There's a thing called the sunset clause, which means that your marketing authorization is not valid forever. You need to market the product in at least one member state within 3 years of that Commission decision. Otherwise, your marketing authorization expires. And the validity of the marketing authorization is also something that depends on a couple of factors. So if you received a conditional marketing authorization, then that's only valid for 1 year. So you have to renew it every year. For a normal full MAA, the validity is 5 years. So after 5 years, you need to send a renewal, and then once it's been renewed after those initial 5 years, the MAA is then valid forever. And companies must submit their renewal not on the day the MAA expires, but at least 9 months before. So that gives time for the whole procedure to take place. And of course, there are changes. You don't just renew the MA, but there are changes to the marketing authorizations, either introduced by the company because maybe they change manufacturing sites or formulations, or they want to add a new strength or a new presentation, or they've done new studies, they want a new indication, or there's new safety data, etc. But there are also changes requested by the EMA. So, for example, any post-authorization commitment, or in legislation. So, for example, the periodic safety update reports, which I will mention in a few minutes, or any referrals initiated by EMA. And these changes to the marketing authorizations are introduced via a variation. There are a few other things, but we'll just focus on variations. And the variations can vary in type. So we have type 1A, type 1B, and type 2 variations, as well as line extensions. So I won't go into all the details on the slide, but essentially type 1A and type 1B are pretty administrative or very minor changes. Type 2 are complex changes really to the market authorization, requiring a full scientific assessment, generally with an impact on benefit risk. And they have to go through committee, through CHMP or PRAC. And usually they can take 60 days for the majority, or 90 days in case they're an extension of indication. And then we have line extensions, and these are addition of a new strength or presentation to the MA. So if you had a 30 milligram tablet and you want to have a 100 milligram tablet, and this again requires full scientific assessment, new benefit risk for that new presentation, and it goes through again CHMP and PRAC. And this actually has a timetable the same as an initial MA, because it's a whole new presentation of the product. So there's a lot of changes that can happen after the initial marketing authorization. And then, as I mentioned, there are some mandatory changes. So these are the post-approval commitments that we've imposed as EMA, and we would like the authorization holders to do. And we have different categories of those also. We have specific obligations, which again are imposed on a conditional marketing authorization or MA under exceptional circumstances. We have Annex 2 conditions. So I mentioned that we put conditions in Annex 2. We have some MEAs, they're called, so RMP measures. So these are additional pharmacovigilance activities, so usually category 3 studies. Then we have some legally binding measures and some letters of recommendation. So these are all things that we can ask companies to do, and then they will have to submit, usually within a determined time frame. And then a quick word on the periodic safety update report. So this is mandated in legislation. It's the absolute minimum that a company would have to do after approval if there's no other impositions on them. After the initial authorization, a company will have to submit a PSUR every 6 months for the first 2 years, so 4 times, and then once a year for the following 2 years, and then it moves to every 3 years. I should say, though, that it's the PRAC, the Pharmacovigilance Committee, that assesses PSURs, and if they see a need, they can impose different durations. So if they think that after the first 2 years, they would still want to see a report every 6 months, then they can change that, and they can make sure that the cadence is kept to 6 months. Equally, if after 2 or 3 years they see actually there's nothing really to monitor, it's all looking very safe and very good, then they can extend to maybe 5 years for the next one. So they are able to change the deadline for the next PSUR. And these deadlines are all kept in a database that is called the European Union Reference Dates Database, the EURD list. The first date is set on the European birth date, which is the date of approval in the EU, or on the international birth date. And generally what companies want to do is align their reporting requirements across the globe, and so they will go for the international birth date, which is the first approval in the first country anywhere in the world. That means that then they will submit these periodic reports on the same day across the globe. It's easier for them. Again, if you want to understand more of the PSUR, the content of what should be submitted is included in Good Pharmacovigilance Practice Module 7. So you can have a look at that on our website again. And the objective really of the PSUR is to present a comprehensive analysis of the risk balance of the product. So looking at all the data emerging as the product is being used in the market since the initial approval. It's the PRAC that assesses the PSUR unless it's a national product only marketed in one country, in which case that one country will look at it. But of course, for all oncology products, all centralized, it all goes through the PRAC. And the PSUR assessment, if there's potentially a new signal, a new safety issue coming up, it can then lead to changes to the SMPC. Again, the PRAC can decide that there's needed then to change potentially some adverse events or whatever in the SMPC, and that will be done following a PSUR. So I'll stop there. I know it was a lot to cover,